very nice to be here with all of you today, and I hope I will abide by the time constraints. So I'm going to start just by sharing my screen. Okay, and I know it may seem a little strange for me to start with a question to the audience, but I would like to do that. I would like to start by asking whether people here think that representation matters. Another way of asking that question is, does it matter who our representatives are? So would anybody like to weigh in on that question before I get started? You can just go ahead and shout out your response.
I think it does.
Okay, thank you. So it does matter who our representatives are. Anybody else want to weigh in on the question? Okay, well, then I will just proceed. And let me say that what I'm going to do today is to talk at the outset about women's representation in Ghana, in Africa, and more broadly, just kind of provide some background on the whole issue of women's representation. And then I'll move on to the issue of women's representation and social policy, okay? So this slide helps us to put everything into perspective, right? It shows us what the global gender gap in political empowerment remains today. Okay, in 2021, 77.1%. And that compares to economic participation and opportunity at about 42%. And we can see that the gap in health and survival and educational attainment is close to gone, right? And so it just points out to us again what a significant this is of, I would call it, the lack of women's political empowerment. Now, this figure that I have here is the global gender gap index. There are indices for the different African countries. There's tremendous variation across countries, and so I am not showing those figures here. And it's interesting that political empowerment is measured in these three ways: ratios of male to female MPs, ministers, and heads of state. So that's really exactly what I'm going to be talking about in the next few slides. Okay, now we can talk about women's underrepresentation in politics, or we can talk about men's overrepresentation in politics. And I'll get to that in a couple of slides, whether one of those terminologies may be preferable over the other. Here are just some numbers for us to look at. It's not a very pretty slide, but legislatures and executives. So these are just averages for the different regions in the world. And so in 2022, women are only 26.4% of legislatures around the world, a little higher in the Americas, and that's primarily because South America has some very high representations of women. We see Europe is a little bit higher, the Nordic countries, of course, almost approaching gender parity. Sub-Saharan Africa, 26.1%. But the important thing you see here also is regional variation, right? So East and Southern African countries are way ahead of, for example, West Africa. When we look at executives, women are only 26 heads of state or government in 2021, up from 17 in 2017. But if we figure there are about 190 countries around the world, that's not a very high percentage. And then these other figures are for percent of ministers. And I'll return to those figures in a moment. So that was legislatures and executives. Judiciaries are more difficult to track. Like with executives and cabinet ministers, there's no central source of data, or there are just emerging central sources of data. For legislatures, we have the Interparliamentary Union that publishes new data on women's representation around the world every month, okay? And then in terms of judiciaries, as you all know, in many countries, you'll find different types of courts or legal systems coexisting, so that makes measurement difficult as well. Courts exist at many different levels. But, at the same time, and again, as you well know from experience in Ghana, there have been many women Supreme Court Chief Justices and presidents of constitutional courts. So we do see some movement in terms of judiciaries as well. Okay, so is it a problem that men are overrepresented or that women are underrepresented? And in offering this response here, I'm drawing upon two scholars, Anne Phillips, a book that she did in 1998, and then Rainbow Murray, a more recent article from 2014. And so the arguments they make, and these are basically arguments in favor of gender parity, right? And gender parity would be an equal representation of men and women. So the first is a justice argument. It's unjust and unfair for men to be overrepresented. The second, a democracy argument. So this idea that bodies and polities will be more democratic if they're more representative and inclusive. A women's interest argument, women's interests and concerns more likely to be represented by other women. And then a role models argument. So that if there's a lack of role models, that discourages more women and girls from becoming involved. And then this last reason is the one from Rainbow Murray from a more recent article. And I think this is very important and not something that we think about very often. Selecting too many people from a restricted talent pool is intrinsically problematic as it compromises the quality of representation for all. So if we're only pulling from, men, that's a restricted talent pool, right? We're not thinking about all those very talented, very qualified women out there who, can be representing us just as well. Okay, and then this question of, which way do we frame this? Men's overrepresentation or women's underrepresentation? I think we're all very used to the framing of women's underrepresentation. And so then women are the other, right? Women are the problem. And we have to seek to fix this problem of women's underrepresentation. That also means that there's going to be greater scrutiny of women and women candidates, while men and men candidates are not being scrutinized in the same way. The framing as overrepresentation of men also means that there needs to be a reduction in their appropriate share of representation. So again, that means that men have to prove their worth rather than women always having to prove their worth. But, there is another way of framing this rather than a focus on men or women. And of course, this is a very binary way of looking at things. We could think just in terms of creating a more gender equal society, right? Now, when we think about representation, scholars think generally in terms of descriptive representation and then substantive and symbolic representation, which I'll be getting to later in the program. And so descriptive representation, of course, is the extent to which a representative resembles those being represented, or you could say the extent to which a legislature, a body, represents, the citizenry of that country. And so when we look at legislatures around the world, and I think you would recognize this as well, what we see is that all of us, all of the different people that we are, tend to be represented by older, affluent, educated, cisgender, straight men from the dominant ethnic, religious, and racial groups, okay? And that's certainly the case in the United States. Our Senate, maybe the most important legislative body in the country, is full of, septuagenarians and octogenarians, and they're all white men or largely white men. Okay, so in the past, when thinking about numbers, people have mentioned this concept of critical mass, which again, you may be familiar with from other sectors. And so for a time, there was this idea that, okay, we just need to get a certain percentage of women, for example, into parliament, 30%, that would be a critical mass. And that once that mass is reached, there'll be some kind of transformative impacts, okay, taking place inside and outside legislatures. I think that, as I said, that was an idea from years and decades ago, and now people are thinking more in terms of gender parity. At the same time, when people were thinking about critical mass, there was also this idea, well, maybe it's not critical mass, maybe it's not numbers, but you need critical actors. Can they be just as significant? So you need, those 10 women, for example, who are going to push a certain piece of legislation or a certain policy agenda. But again, as I said, I think people around the world today are thinking in terms of gender parity. And then I'm just mentioning here, when President Biden came into office in 2021 and he was appointing his cabinet, he said very explicitly that he wanted a cabinet that looked like America. And so CNN, for example, provided a page on which one could track, to what extent his cabinet appointments look like America in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, age, education, and so on and so forth. And so I will say that in terms of gender, Biden did appoint a cabinet that is 47% women, and that's the highest it's ever been. And that, of course, is almost parity, right? And, no president has come close to that in the US until now. Okay, so here are just some numbers, again, to put Ghana into context. And so when we compare legislatures, when we're looking at women's representation, we look at the single house of parliament, if there's a single house, or the lower house, if there are two houses. And so what we can see from the list, this is just from last month, there are about 15 African countries that have 30% women or more in their parliaments, in their national legislatures. Okay, so that's really good and that's really significant. And I think everyone knows that Rwanda leads the world, and Rwanda has led the world for about 20 years. Okay, down there at the bottom, 15%, Ghana. And the worst country in Africa, believe it or not, or maybe it's easy to believe, is Nigeria with 4%. And then you see, again, for purposes of comparison, the world and sub-Saharan African averages are about the same. The US in the House of Representatives is up to 28.6%, and that's much higher than it's ever been. It's been in the low 20s for some time. And that, interestingly enough, is largely a trend that began in the 2018 election, so 2 years after President Trump was elected. And a lot of people saw, a very diverse, in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, candidate pool emerge because of a perception of threat. So Donald Trump so threatened people that they thought they needed to stand for political office, and that has diversified the House of Representatives. Okay, so again, just a deeper dive into women elected to parliament in Ghana. This is from the political transition in 1992. And so again, you see that women from the 2020 election are 14.5% of the current parliament, and that is the highest it's ever been, okay? All right, so we can also look at women in cabinet, and of course, those are appointed positions, not elected positions, and so that's a very important distinction, and I'd be happy to talk about, the implications of that distinction. And so I wonder, does someone need to mute? Does someone need to mute their sound? Okay. All right, so the trend around the world, I don't know if it's a trend, but there's some movement in the direction of gender parity cabinets in Africa and in the world. So right now there's more than a dozen countries that have gender parity cabinets, and 3 of those, as of early 2021, were in Africa: Rwanda, Guinea-Bissau, and South Africa. There are other African countries that have had gender parity cabinets. Maybe now they're at about 40%. Okay, so again, as we know from the previous slide, the average women's representation in cabinets in Africa in early 2019, 22.5%, around the global average. And again, as with legislatures, significant regional variation. So we see East Africa leading and West Africa lagging. And I'd be happy to talk about, those kinds of differences if anybody is interested. Now, I think it's also important to note that just because there may be a high percentage of women in legislatures, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is a high percentage of women in cabinets, although often it is the case. It can also be the case that there will be a low percentage of women in parliament and more women in cabinet, a higher percentage. And that again goes to the difference of being appointed versus being elected. And then again, this should be familiar probably to everyone that around the world, there are certain portfolios that you're more likely to see women appointed to when they are appointed as cabinet ministers. Okay, and then again, just to kind of bring the point home to Ghana, this is women appointed to cabinet in Ghana, 1992 to 2020. And I didn't mention at the outset, but since my Fulbright in 2016, I've been doing a lot of work with Professor Okosia Darkwa. We have 2 book chapters and 2 journal articles that we've written on women in parliament and cabinet in Ghana. Our most recent article looks at the cabinet appointment process in Ghana. And so that's where some of this information comes from. So it's very interesting to see a very low percentage right now, 16% of women in cabinet. And the highest was under President Mahama, 32%. So twice the percentage of what it is now. It's also interesting to know, we found out during our interviews that actually some of Mahama's team was interested in appointing a gender parity cabinet, but they weren't able to because of various formal and informal rules that exist as part of the appointment process. Okay, so yes, if we get more women in parliament, for example, what do they do? And so, as I mentioned previously, some of the concepts that are used include substantive representation and symbolic representation. And these are 2 definitions that I really like, and they come from a book by Francescette Crook and Piscopo, published in 2012. And so substantive representation is what maybe all of you who are concerned about social policy might be more interested in. So that is advancing women's interests through the policymaking process, right? Whether publicly or behind the scenes. This may be measured, for example, in terms of promoting or accomplishing certain policy agendas or legislative items. So in other words, the laws, that are passed. And, does a greater presence of women in parliament mean that, certain types of laws are going to be passed? Now, symbolic representation is also very interesting and very important in my mind. I'm going to talk more about both of them. So symbolic representation is altering gendered ideas about the roles of women and men in politics, raising awareness of what women can achieve, legitimating women as political actors, encouraging women to become more involved in politics themselves, right, as voters, activists, candidates, and leaders. So symbolic representation tends to take place outside of parliament, right? Whereas substantive representation is taking place inside parliament or the national legislature. And symbolic representation is really about changing people's ideas, right? Changing people's ideas and attitudes. And so when we look at substantive representation impacts in Africa, and that's what this slide is looking at, a lot of the research that has been done, and obviously has been done in those countries that have had more women in parliament for longer periods of time. Okay, so that would be Rwanda, Uganda, South Africa, Namibia, Mozambique, Tanzania, and so on and so forth. So those are the countries in Africa, again, that have had more women for longer periods of time. And the research shows us that in those countries, we see new laws in the areas of gender-based violence, family law, and land rights, among others. From Rwanda, we've heard from Rwandan women MPs that, with more women MPs, gender agendas are guaranteed. And they see gender equity as something that, they are modeling for the global north. So an idea coming from the global south that they are modeling for the global north. A gendered lens being used to analyze national budgets, and overall just a gendered perspective on the legislative process. Now, there are other impacts, but these don't really fall under the ideas of policy agendas or new laws. But it has also been documented that we see improvements in parliamentary cultures, so how members of parliament interact with each other, how they debate on the parliament floor, the creation of women's parliamentary caucuses. This is really, really important. Cross-party caucuses can be a real force for change and progress. I talked about this earlier, the appointment of more women potentially to cabinets and to more prominent cabinet portfolios. And then I forgot to mention that in all of those cases where there are more women in parliament in Africa, it has to do something with either the type of electoral system that is used or the adoption of electoral gender quotas or both. And in the case of some kind of reserved seat or special seat quota, those are oftentimes used as stepping stones to constituency seats, okay, to the idea that women are going to run for directly elected positions after they've obtained experience in special or reserved seats. Okay, now when we look at symbolic representation impacts, and again, this is just to give you a sampling from across the continent, I said that, these impacts are very important. I don't know if they're more important, but, you have to keep in mind how weak legislatures as a rule are across the African continent, right? They tend to be dominated by the executive branch. Ghana is a really good case. Many of the MPs are ministers or deputy ministers. You have what's called a hybrid government, right? Because of the presence of the executive branch in the legislature, if you will. But for example, some of the kinds of things that I mentioned earlier, so from Uganda, we know that there have been changes in political culture. This is based on survey research, such that the political culture has become more accepting and appreciative of women's participation in politics and women's leadership. From Rwanda and from Tanzania, researchers have heard about an increased respect for family, for women in family and community. Women's enhanced capacity to speak and be heard in public fora, their greater autonomy and decision-making in the family, and greater access to education. An article that I did from Botswana references the third impact, women asserting a right to take on other traditionally male roles, such as chief. So this was research around 2013, published in an article in 2016. In Botswana, women were never chiefs. They were never the paramount chiefs. They might be regents, holding a chiefly position for a nephew or a son. But anyway, around 2010, and as there was a greater discourse around women's increased participation, the minister of local government who oversaw chieftaincy was also a woman. Then some women from chiefly families said, why can't I be the chief? And so indeed, they did become chiefs. And then this final impact, increases in women's political engagement. And so this is from a cross-national study over time that looked at what happens when women's representation in parliament increases. Do more women vote? And it was found that yes, that is an impact. Okay, so my last few slides broadly at some literature that I could find on this question of women's representation and gender-sensitive policies, and or social policy. And so this is an article from 2016 that looks at women's political inclusion in sub-Saharan Africa, 2007 to 2015. It also has 2 case studies. Again, the relationship between women's political representation and these laws. And so the finding was that all else being equal, countries with a higher share of women in national parliaments are more likely to pass and implement gender-sensitive laws in 5 areas: laws on quotas, laws on parental authority and divorce, laws on domestic violence, laws on rape, and laws on sexual harassment. So this coincides a little bit with the previous slide I showed looking at substantive representation impacts. So this idea of female MPs having an impact in passing laws, removing gender biases in the laws, and empowering women in both private and public arenas. Okay, so here is another study that was done or published in 2019 And this references gender and climate change. And so this is a question that has been of great interest to a lot of European scholars. Do female parliamentarians make a difference? In their research, based on data from a large sample of countries, female representation leads countries to adopt more stringent climate change policies. And they further say that this relationship is likely to be causal, so it's not just a correlation. What they've also found is because of the stringency of these climate change policies that are being adopted, the representation of women in parliament results in lower carbon dioxide emissions. And so what the authors of this article are arguing is that women's political representation, should be seen as a tool for addressing climate change, as a way of addressing climate change. So presumably more women is going to mean, better climate change policies. Okay, there is also the organization called UN Women, and they have looked also at impacts globally. And they suggest, that there is established and growing evidence that women's leadership and political decision-making processes improves policy outcomes for women. So one of the outcomes that they cite is in India. So there's been a lot of research on India and the panchayats, which is the local level of government, where there have been quotas in place for quite some time. The number of drinking water projects in areas with women-led councils was 62% higher than those in men-led councils. And then some research from Norway, a direct causal relationship between the presence of women in municipal councils, so again at the local level, and childcare coverage. And so then this report references again this idea of women working across party lines. It's not to say that it always happens, but oftentimes it does through parliamentary women's caucuses. And, even in the most politically combative, the most partisan environments, we may find women coming together to champion these kinds of issues. Okay, this is from a publication by NDI, the National Democratic Institute, which is based in the United States. And again, also talks about, why we might want to see more women in politics. This idea of women working across party lines. There's I can't remember the specific details now, but there's a significant moment in US congressional politics where women are also, attributed with having kind of saved the day on a specific piece of legislation by coming together across party lines. Women lawmakers as being responsive to constituent concerns. Something that I haven't talked about is the role of women in ending conflicts, securing the peace, building the peace. UN Security Council Resolution 1325 was all about that, the role of women in ending conflict and building peace. Women's participation is encouraging citizen confidence in democracy. And again, if we think back to the idea that, a more representative and inclusive legislative body is likely to be more democratic or contribute to democracy in the country as a whole. Particular areas that women prioritize. And then just, kind of a final conclusion. Strong evidence that as more women are elected to office, there's also a corollary increase in policymaking that emphasizes quality of life and reflects the priorities of families, women, ethnic, and racial minorities. Okay, and then I was just going to close with someone well known to all of you, Kofi Annan. I mean, this is not a new idea. There is no tool for development more effective than the empowerment of women. Raising economic productivity, reducing child and maternal mortality, increasing the chances of education for the next generation, and so on and so forth. So this is at least a good 15 years old. But I think what we need to think about here is, in particular, the political empowerment of women. And I guess that is the argument that I've been making today. And I hope that in some way I have persuaded you that it does matter who our representatives are, and that there are implications for social policy, which is the area that you all in particular are interested in. So I think that's the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions. I see there is a comment that says, wow, although I don't know what that was referring to. One of the slides, no doubt, about Ghana, right?
Thank you very much for the presentation. Now we can have our questions. It was very interesting. I was particularly surprised to see that Nigeria in particular has just 3% of women in politics. So I think that is very interesting to note. Now the floor is open. Please raise your hand and then I can call you to ask your questions. I can start. So I've been thinking about maybe probably playing the devil's advocate, even though I'm a woman. It's how those who are going to be very critical of, how we sometimes romanticize women, or the instrumentalization of, women empowerment, for example. Like how do you see it? I mean, to what extent are we really able to address, the structural causes of some of these underrepresentation issues? So for example, if you look at the process for becoming an MP in Ghana, it's just obviously very costly. Most women will just not be able to, they will just not be able to compete with men in those parties. And so like how do you see that, and how are we able to really discuss this in relation to the fact that there are still some structural issues that really affect women's ability to actually even impact or be represented in politics?
Okay, thank you. That was a few questions, but thank you for that. And should I take a few more questions or
that's fine.
Answer one at a time? Maybe Samuel,
Yeah.
Samuel?
Yes, hello.
Hello.
Yes, thank you very much for your amazing presentation. I was the one who said wow, because I was just amazed at how women was contributing to climate, change, and that was really fantastic. I have some questions. The first question is that you realize that when you are working under women bosses, it's like I think they feel like they have to perform. So sometimes there's so much pressure on the subordinates. Like there's so much tension. Hey, my boss is very hard. My boss is very difficult. So then, how do you get women to be easy with their with their subordinates, so that yes, we can achieve the productivity that we want? That's the first question. The second question is that I think that creating the space for women to occupy in, let's say, parliament, well, from a psychologist perspective, it's not enough. We also have to find out whether they have the empowerment, as in the knowledge, the skills, the abilities, and others to perform in the various roles that they are put into. So how do we ensure that women are not only given the opportunity to be represented in parliament or in where policy making these policies are made, but that they are also have the skills and the knowledge and the abilities to perform? And then another one is also, another question is that we have some women who are not as interested in empowering their colleague women. You see some women who they don't want to see other women, rise. And we have some men who also, who really want to see other women, rise the ranks. So how do you, if you are selecting, let's say, women to represent, let's say, a space in parliament, how are you able to detect whether this woman is really interested in the empowerment of her colleagues? Let me put it in that quote. Thank you very much.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, well, I'll start with this round of questions. So to go to Samuel, do you want to mute, please? Samuel, can you mute, please? To go to the first question about the romanticization of women, I guess that's what I was seeking to undo with this presentation, right? Which was to say that it's not a romanticization of women, that in fact, if you look at the research shows that, you know, women do act in these ways when they get into parliament in greater numbers, okay? But then to come to the issue of, you know, how women get into parliament, and this is something that I do really like to talk about, and I'll try not to get into the weeds. But, you know, one of the crucial distinctions that always needs to be drawn is what kind of electoral system does a country have, right? And so Ghana has the single member district, plurality majority, first past the post, you know, winner takes all, however you want to call it, type of electoral system, which is also the electoral system that we have in the United States. And it's largely the one that you'll find in all the former British colonies across Africa, okay? The other type of electoral system or family of electoral systems is proportional representation systems, and those tend to be in the former French and Portuguese colonies. European countries, as a rule, tend to have the PR system. Okay, the single member district SMD system is woman unfriendly and it's quota unfriendly. And again, I won't go into the details of that, but that in and of itself is one of the things that helps to explain why Ghana's representation is so low, why Botswana, Zambia, Malawi, Nigeria, you know, all of these countries have that electoral system, which, you know, in another presentation I could talk more about. What it means is that candidates stand, as you well know, in a specific constituency, whereas with the PR system, you vote for a party and the candidates are names on the party's list, right? And voters may not even know what those names are on the party list, right? And parties can decide to have a gender parity list by just having man, woman, man, woman, man, woman on their list, right? There's your quota right there. In Ghana, and Akosia Darkwa and I have done a lot of research on this. Yes, it costs a lot of money, as everybody knows, to stand for parliament. I would say that women are not, you know, terribly disadvantaged by that. They are somewhat disadvantaged by that, but I don't know if that's the biggest issue. There's also what we call the politics of insult, right? But again, that's very widespread. It affects men and women, but I think it affects women more. But then the other issue that I already referenced is the idea of a weak legislature. And what we've also found, and I think this was referenced by the first questioner, is, you know, Ghana's legislature is weak. If you are an education advocate and a woman, you may decide that, you know, parliament is not the place to go to accomplish your goals, right? Maybe you'd rather be an activist working for an education NGO. And so in the SMD systems, you know, what matters is getting women to run. When they run, and this is true in Ghana, when women run, they win in proportion to their candidacies. So if women are 10% of the candidates, and you can go and look, the data is there, it was actually in the table that I showed. If women are 10% of the candidates, they will win 10% or more of the seats, okay? So what that tells you is that voters, Ghanaians, do not discriminate against women candidates. So in Ghana, as in the US, as in many other countries, it's about getting women to stand, all right? But, you know, then we have to think about, you know, why might they not want to, right? And that's another interesting conversation that we can have. Interestingly, in Nigeria, so this is different. They will be 15% of the candidates in Nigeria, but they will only win 5% of the seats. So in Nigeria, voters are discriminating against women candidates. Okay, I'd like to, the issue about women bosses, I'm not really sure what I can say to that, and I'm not sure how relevant that is to the discussion at hand here. But I'd like to address the two other questions by Samuel about, yes, we can create the space for women to occupy, but do they have the knowledge, the skills, the abilities? And this is a pretty annoying and insulting question. And as I suggested before, are we asking that same question about every male MP, right? Does he have the knowledge, the skills, and the abilities? Okay. And studies have shown us over and over again, okay, everywhere in the world, and that includes in Africa, that women have to exhibit a performance premium. Women are actually likely to be more qualified. Okay, they're likely to have more skills, more abilities, and more knowledge. And it's relatively easy to do this research in some countries. I think not in Ghana, because I'm not sure that information is available on the parliamentary webpage. But a study has been done, or a few studies have been done in Uganda, which show very clearly, that women MPs are just as qualified and competent, if not more so, than their male colleagues. And so again, the important issue, and this transcends sectors, is this idea of the performance premium that women have to exhibit. Okay. And then this idea that women are not interested in empowering other women. I mean, okay, fine. I'm sure there are anecdotes that may support that statement. And people love to refer to PhD, right? The pull her down syndrome. And, there's also a lot of lore around this idea that women don't vote for other women. Okay, that's absolutely not true either. Nobody has, we don't know, well, we may know, but there's no literature that supports that idea. The issue, as I mentioned already, is that women are typically not the candidates in great enough numbers. But, again, I think those are stories that people like to tell in order to discredit the idea of women's political empowerment.
Thank you.
Further questions?
Any further questions?
Yes, I have one. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the disparities you see in representation in East Africa versus West Africa. If you could talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Okay, yes, I'd be happy to do that. And I did mention that in my presentation. So if we look at legislatures, right, and cabinets, right, West Africa lags behind East Africa and Southern Africa. And so part of the issue is electoral system that I just talked about, and also the adoption of quotas, okay? So across East and Southern Africa, countries have adopted gender quotas, okay? And that makes a huge difference. Also in South America, where representations are very high, it's because of the adoption of gender quotas. And what happened was a lot of this has to do with historical reasons. And so in East and Southern Africa, when liberation movements came to power, as in South Africa, Namibia, Angola, and Mozambique, they had gender equality as part of their missions, right? And so women were then part and parcel of the political transitions that took place in the early 1990s, drafting new constitutions, drafting new electoral laws, and putting these quotas into place. In East Africa, there was some of that as well when, for example, the NRM, the National Resistance Movement, first came to power in Uganda, when the Rwandan Patriotic Front came to power in Rwanda, and so on and so forth. There was diffusion of these ideas across borders. So, that has been part of the political trajectory and the process in East and Southern Africa. One of the questions I've also asked, I have a 2017 article from the journal published by the Institute for African Studies that leg on, is, and I think this has to do with the lower representations of women in West Africa. West Africa is where military rule and military coups was predominant, right? Were predominant during the 1960s to 1990s. And so that could also be a question, to what extent there's a legacy of military rule, there's an impact of decades of military rule on women's representation in politics or women's participation in politics, the December 31st women's movement notwithstanding. Yeah, so I think those are the main things: electoral systems, gender quotas, political and historical trajectories. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Jeffrey, please, you can go ahead with your question.
Okay, thank you very much. My question is, what do you think should and can be done to get women to stand for parliamentary positions?
That's a great question. What can be done to get women to stand for parliamentary positions? If anybody here has an idea, I'd be interested in hearing that. So in one of the bits of in one of the bits of research that we did, Akosia Darkwa and I did, we looked at a mechanism that the political parties put in place. So NDC and MPP, some years ago, some elections ago, put in place a mechanism to reduce the filing fees, right, for women and youth candidates. And so that was, an effort on their behalf, I guess, to try to encourage more women candidates. In some cases it wasn't really followed through on, but in other cases maybe it was followed through on. But what we found was it didn't really make any difference because the filing fees are just a drop in the bucket, right, compared to the overall cost of standing for parliament. But, maybe some measures around, funding of political parties, funding of candidates by a central source could make some kind of difference. I guess organizations, civil society organizations could, put forward women candidates. As I mentioned, what happened in the United States in 2018, that a perception of threat once Donald Trump was elected motivated many women and candidates of color to stand for political office in ways that they had not in the past. And then I don't know if any changes could be made to, the parliament itself and what is able to be accomplished in parliament. I mean, another thing that the parties could do, and this doesn't as much have to do with women standing, but the parties could put into place what's referred to as a safe seat strategy, right? And that is something that could be very effectively done in Ghana because there are so many safe seats for parliament, right? So we know that, in certain constituencies, we know that the NDC is going to win no matter what, right? We know that in other constituencies, the MPP is going to win almost no matter what, not totally no matter what. And so what you could do is the parties could decide, okay, we're going to make sure that women stand in those constituencies, right, as our candidate, because we know we're going to win. And then, one last point is just to focus on the party primaries, right? I think scholars, of African politics, of African elections haven't focused sufficiently on party primaries. And these are the mechanisms in the SMT electoral systems, right, where candidate recruitment and selection takes place. And so we really need to focus on the party primaries, how they work. The NDC tried to open up their primaries, right, I think the 2016 election, where everybody would vote and not just, a handful of delegates, right? And so that process really needs to be interrogated, right? The party primary process, to see whether that could have an impact on, bringing more candidates to step forward.
Okay, thank you. There's another, is it a question or a statement? I'm not sure. So it's from Marian. She says, socially, that is culturally, religiously, and traditionally, the primary or traditional roles attributed to women in the society makes it difficult for women to go into politics. So what was done in countries like Rwanda that has brought these changes we see, that can be done to change the stereotypes and reality of social roles that tend to cripple women who want to go into politics themselves. And I think he's trying to look at the cultural differences between maybe the Eastern African countries and then Ghana and maybe probably other West African countries.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I would have a hard time talking about, cultural differences between these regions. And so I would more likely look at like historical and political reasons. But, think of what happened in Rwanda, right? The genocide. And people say, it was after the genocide that all these changes took place, right? And, people suggest that after the genocide, 70% of the population was women or something like that, right? Millions of people had fled outside the country in addition to the, million or so who had been killed, right? But then over time, the population started to even out. But because of women's roles in the RPF, when they came to power, they decided that they wanted to make, political roles in government available to women as well. And again, I talked about how in Southern Africa, there were these liberation movements that eventually came to power, right, against the colonial power, against South Africa, against the apartheid regime, and so on and so forth. So, there were these moments of transition during which, women's movements are very critical, became involved. And, again, thinking about West Africa, Ghana did have a political transition from military rule to now more democratic rule, but it wasn't an end to conflict. And I think a lot of people would agree that maybe the constitution, drafting process in 1992, 1991 wasn't what it should have been or could have been, right? And indeed, there have been efforts to go back, the Constitutional Review Commission in 2010, to go back and revisit that constitution, and recommendations were made, but they were never acted upon or followed up. So, as I said, then differences in culture across the region.
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions? Okay. But does it matter when women are appointed or elected? It's something I've been thinking about when it comes to their ability to really make any impact.
Okay. So the question was about, being appointed versus being elected. And so, I drew that distinction when referencing cabinet and the legislature, right? So ministers are appointed, right? And members of parliament are elected. And so, if we're saying that the problem is getting women to stand, or the problem is somehow the party primary process, then, with appointments, it shouldn't be an issue, right? The president should just be able to appoint, whoever he pleases, in effect, right? And we did find in our study of the appointment process in Ghana that the president does have a very significant amount of power, but the Constitution does have some, say in how the appointment process proceeds. There's supposed to be a regional balance. And so what happens in Ghana, of the 19 ministers in cabinet, there's going to be one more or less from every region. Well, at least in the past, the 10, I'm not sure what happens with the 16. When there's a regional balance, that also provides maybe a little bit of ethnic balance as well. There's supposed to be a gender balance, but that has routinely been ignored. The other balance is that, half of ministers are supposed to come from parliament, right? And so then, it makes it very difficult on top of everything else to also make sure that there's, gender parity. Although, again, it can be done. I think even in Ghana, it could be done. I think the current administration doesn't have a commitment to gender equality. Maybe that's, too strong, but that's my observation. The gender minister, all discussion of her aside, the gender ministry is not even in cabinet under the current president. And that's the first time that that's been that way since 2000.
Thank you. Mahawa.
Hi. So my question is with regards to what someone asked about women versus being difficult. I think it's kind of linked with the opinion or perception that women practice politics differently. So my question is, are there any established different gender rules on political behavior between men and women? You know, could that be the reason as to why women are not well represented?
Whether there are differences in men and women's political behavior, is that what the question was?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's, beyond my area of expertise, I guess. And, I think it would probably be difficult to make a sweeping generalization, right, about that question. And so, what I have talked about is what the literature shows us, right, on the substantive representation of women's interests and the symbolic representation impacts of having more women in Parliament. And so I think I would just like to confine my remarks to that. Again, I'm sure we could tell stories about male bosses who are difficult, right? So sorry if I can't answer that question.
All right, thank you. I guess I always also think about this also in relation to the fact that, just like you mentioned, there's always, this need to perform and this extraordinary need for women to perform extraordinarily if they are appointed. And I think this could also be part of the reasons why probably there's that perception around women. That is just by the way. Yes, our time is up. I think we had a very fruitful conversation. There's a lot of questions that I'm sure we can keep asking and going on and on and on. I have particularly been thinking about, how do we even classify women as a homogeneous group? Which groups of women are able to represent women better? So the young, the old, the educated. So I think there's a lot of questions that we can certainly go on with, but we don't have much time. But we had a very good discussion, and thank you very much for making time with us. Yes, we hope that we can.
Okay. Yeah. And it's my pleasure. And I just want to say I'm not in Ghana right now, but I'm coming back. I was there this June and July. I'm coming back in September. And as mentioned, I'll be at Miyasa at Legon starting in February and just working on some other research from September onwards. So I'm happy to pursue the conversation with anybody who's interested.
That's great. That's great. Thank you very much. So enjoy the rest of your day and have a good evening to everyone who's also in Ghana. And we'll meet the next 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you.